Good afternoon, guys. So we're going to go ahead today and pick back up with quadratics, but we're looking at some different problems that we looked at the other day, okay? So every single problem that I gave you on the previous NTI assignment, you could solve by factoring. But here's the thing, you won't be able to solve every quadratic by factoring. So today we're looking at what do I do when I can't solve by factoring? What's another method that I can use? And there's one skill that you need before we actually talk about that method, and that's that you need to be able to simplify square roots. So let's say that I have the square root of 72, and I want to simplify that. Okay, well, I'm looking for any number that goes into 72. I picked 2 and 36. You might pick 8 and 9. Okay, it doesn't matter what numbers you pick as long as you pick some that go into 72. So I picked 2 and 36, and then I said, well, if I look at 2 here, I can't simplify that down any farther because the only thing that multiplies to 2 is 1 times 2. So there's nothing I can do with that. But I can break down 36. If I break down 36, that'll break down into 6 and 6. And then those 6's will also break down again. The 6's will break down into 2 times 3. Okay? And once I get that far, there is nothing else I can break down. All these 2's and all these 3's are called prime numbers. They're as simple as I can get them. Okay? And at this point, here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for pairs of the same number, because anytime you have squares or square roots, that means you're looking for 2 of something. And right here, I've color-coded them. You've got 2 2's and you've got 2 3's. And then the only other thing you have is this one lonely little 2. So here's what I have to remember when I simplify square roots. Think about it in terms of dating. If you have a partner, you get to go out. So these 2's right here that form a pair, they're going to get to come outside the square root. So I'm going to have a 2 on the outside of the square root. I also have a pair of 3's. So those 3's are going to get to come outside with the 2's, kind of like on a double date. But this lonely little 2 up here that didn't have a partner, it didn't get to go out. It had to stay inside the square root. So look what I have here. I had a pair of 2's, so I put a 2 on the outside of the square root. I had a pair of 3's, so I put a 3 on the outside of the square root. Okay? So what does that become? Well, 2 times 3 is 6. And then there's nothing that I can do with the lonely little 2 that's on the inside of the square root. It just has to stay there. And there's my final answer. So the square root of 72 is the same thing as 6 square root of 2. Okay, so with that skill in mind, let's look at our other method of solving quadratics. So let's say I gave you this equation right here and I asked you to solve that. Okay, well, first problem I notice, there is a number in front of x squared. That doesn't necessarily mean that I can't factor something, but it does mean that it's probably going to be more difficult, okay? There's nothing that I can pull out of 8, 7, and 8, so there's no way for me to simplify that down. But here's what I can do. The quadratic formula, which we learned about earlier this year, okay, it will solve every single quadratic equation that you ever see. So where factoring only works sometimes, the quadratic formula works every time. So a couple things we need to identify. The quadratic formula has 3 letters in it, A, B, and C. Those 3 letters will stand for the 3 numbers in your equation. Okay, so A here is going to be the number with x squared, so A is 8. B is going to be the number with x, so B is 7. And C is going to be the number by itself. And notice here that's not just 8, that's negative 8, so that sign comes with it. Okay, well, once I know what A, B, and C are, all I have to do is plug this information in the formula where it goes. Okay, so the first thing I see here, and watch how I read this, if I see a negative B, I read that as opposite B. So when I look at what B is 7. What's the opposite of that? Well, it's negative 7. So the first thing I type is negative 7. Then I've got my plus or minus symbol and a square root. And then it says B squared. Well, what's B? B is 7. And notice I'm putting that in parentheses. Okay. Then I have a minus 4. That minus 4 is just part of the equation. It will always be there. Okay. Then lastly, I have AC. So I'm going to put A in parentheses, which is 8. And I'm going to put C in parentheses, which is negative 8. Okay. Well, then I'm ready to go to the bottom. And the bottom just says 2 times a. So I write my 2, and then a is 8. Let me make this just a little bit bigger where you can see it a little better. There we go. Oh, didn't let me. Let's try that again. There we go. Now you can see a little better. I want you to watch what I do here. I'm going to start just simplifying this thing step by step, and I'm going to allow Desmos to help me here. Okay? So I am not going to type this whole fraction in at one time in my calculator, because if I do that, it's going to give me a decimal answer, and I don't want a decimal answer in most cases. So what are some things I can simplify? Well, the first thing I notice, I know what 2 times 8 is. That's 16. So the first thing I can do is go ahead and turn the bottom into a 16. Okay? Well, then what can I do to simplify the top? Well, we're going to leave the negative 7 alone right now because there's nothing I can really do with that. But what I can do is all those numbers that are inside the square root, I can go to Desmos and type those in and see what number they simplify down to. So I've got 7 squared, okay, minus 4 times 8 times negative 8. And it tells me that is 305. Notice here, I didn't type in the square root symbol. All I typed in were the numbers. So watch how I write this. I just put a 305 inside the square root. Now, here's what I always have to check. I always have to check if I can simplify that 305. So just like I broke down the 72 in number 1, I would try to simplify the 305 in number 2. But what I find out is that one doesn't simplify. So this right here is my answer. I'm done right there. Okay? Let's go to number 3 here. Number 3 is going to start off the same way. If you try to factor number 3, you'll find out that you can't, which means I've got to use the quadratic formula. So let's identify A, B, and C. So A is the number with x squared. If I don't see a number with x squared, well, that means that I assume that it's 1. Okay. B is the number with x, so B is negative 6. And C is going to be 7. So all I have to do at this point is just plug in my numbers where they go. Okay, and that ends up being, let's see here, opposite B. So B is negative 6. The opposite of that is 6. Plus or minus the square root of B squared. And watch how I write this. I'm putting negative 6 in parentheses. So negative 6 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A, so 2 times 1. Well, what are some things that I can simplify here? Well, I can't do anything with the 6 on top yet, so I'm just going to have to leave it there. But what I can do is on the bottom, I know that 2 times 1 is just 2. Okay? So on top, I have a 6 plus or minus. And what else can I simplify on top? Well, now I can go to Desmos and I can type all those numbers here that are inside the square root in and see what they give me. So negative 6 squared, and again, notice that negative 6 is in parentheses, minus 4 times A times C. And I get 8. So there's an 8 inside this square root right here. Okay, and again, let me make this just a little bit bigger so you can see it. Okay, now here's the thing. 8 will simplify. So what I have to do here is I have to bring 8 down and break it apart. Okay, and I'll come down to the next line to do that. So let's think about what goes into 8. Well, 4 and 2 would go into 8. So I'll break it up into 4 and 2. Make that just a little bit prettier. So 4 and 2. Well, I can't break down the 2 anymore, but I can break down the 4. 4 becomes 2 and 2. Okay, and again, let me just scoot this over just a little bit so it lines up a little bit better. There we go. So look at what I have here, and I'm going to highlight this. I have a pair of 2's right here. Well, what happens with a square root when we have a pair? Well, they get to go out on a date. So watch how I rewrite this. The 6, nothing changes about it. Okay, it's still a 6. I still have my plus minus. But because I had a pair of 2's, those 2's get to come outside the square root. The lonely little 2 that was left by itself has to stay inside. Over 2. So look what we did. We didn't change anything but the 8. We broke down the 8 right here. Now my very last step here is to look at all those numbers that are outside the square root. Okay, I've got a 6, I've got a 2, and I've got a 2. What can I do with those 3 numbers? Well, I can simplify those. 2 goes into all of them. So I can reduce this fraction. 6 divided by 2 is 3. Okay, so I've got 3 plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is just 1, square root of 2. So you can write a 1 right here, but you don't have to. That's up to you. And that is the end of our video for today. Please let me know if you have questions.